Well, there's a series of very interesting questions that I'm going to have the opportunity to respond to. The first asks, you spoke about the process as one approaches terminal illness. You know, as nurses, we've learned about stages based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. Can you tell me something about how this fits with what you're presenting? Well, I think probably the most important part is that one of the things we learned from Kubler-Ross's work is the idea that this is a process. There are stages to some extent, but this is, I guess the part I'd like to emphasize is this is a process. At every one of those stages, in fact, the coping resources are going to be called upon. So if one is in a stage of denial, you know, that's a stage in which that's a particular form of coping. That's a particular way of dealing with the difficulties that the patient is dealing with. On the other hand, as we go through each of the other stages, what we're seeing is a process that's evolving. I think from a very practical standpoint, what's important is to recognize the fact that different coping is going to be used throughout that it is a process, that we have to be accepting and sensitive to the unique process that, in fact, you know, the patient is going through. Now, from a nursing standpoint or from a healthcare provider standpoint, one of the challenges is just being in sync with where the patient is at a given time, being accepting of that, understanding that, certainly not trying to rush them through one stage to another stage, just as we're not trying to rush them through from one form of coping to another form of coping. So again, I think the takeaway for me would be just a sensitivity to this life process as a process. You know, that's the key element here. You know, as a healthcare professional, what advice can you give me to support families who are in disagreement and best support the patient? I think this is a really challenging one, and one in which we actually don't have a lot of research in terms of these kinds of interventions or who is to be the one to intervene. I think one of the aspects is to normalize the fact that there are going to be differences, and to normalize the fact that not only is the patient in this respect going through a coping process, but the family members are going through a coping process as well. And to help them to develop some sensitivity to and some respect for the fact that there are differences, and if there's one time in a person's life in which their process should be respected, it's during these moments of crisis. So the first thing I think the advice I would give is first to normalize this, The second might be for the person who feels upset that their way of coping isn't being adopted. For example, the family member who's facing the life emergency, the health emergency, is to help them to understand that part of the reason for their adamantly holding on to a certain perspective or wanting to, in a sense, convert their loved one to their perspective is it has to do with what they're feeling. That it isn't just if she would only believe this, if he would only believe this, if they would either just go back to church, if they would only talk to a rabbi, if they'd only talk to a priest, that helping them to see that this isn't only in terms of their care and concern for their loved one, it also has to do with the fact that this is evoking in them a great deal of strain, a great deal of stress. Probably the last takeaway point is to, by modeling this, by showing how one does this, but also some direct advice, is to help them to really appreciate that one of the gifts they can give is to be supportive and be respectful, and to recognize again that this is a process. Now the next question I think is really a challenging one and a good one. You know, when someone loses faith in the face of crisis, how important is it not to force the faith issue? I think this is phrased exactly right. The issue is that we should not force faith on another person. First of all, that would not be authentic faith. You know, that would be something out of coercion. It's a time when someone needs respect. It's precisely at this time. And again, not dissimilar from what I shared in terms of the last question, I think that if we can manage our own anxiety, our own distress, our own difficulty of facing doubt, if we can face that, we'll be more accepting of, for example, the patient's experience of doubt. Also, again, once again, to understand that doubt or a loss of faith is in fact part of a process in which maybe what they're looking for is really, as Dr. Parkman talked about, of looking at a reconstruction of faith, where in fact the faithing is going to change. The faithing is going to evolve in this process, rather than it simply being said that the person has lost their faith. If they're grappling to integrate faith in some form. Obviously this is hard for everyone around them. This is also, I think, the time, if they're open, to have them talk with, a sensitive religious professional. At times even a mental health professional can be helpful to help them to be able to have a dialogue and a conversation. Also, I think actually it's almost impossible to completely lose faith, particularly if someone has had a religious background. It's more a way of talking about the anger and the disillusionment. And sometimes for some individuals it's easier to kind of give up faith rather than to deal with the struggle of it, or rather than to feel, for example, anger towards God. And so part of it is to help them to understand what they're going through, understand the process, to be respectful, but again, ultimately to see this as a process. To be honest, the worst thing I think that one could do is to try to coerce someone into accepting your own faith or someone else's faith. I think that is, just philosophically, I think that's disrespectful. I think clinically, I think for those of you who have attempted that, who have unwittingly done that, you see that it actually aggravates the individual. It actually doesn't help them to engage in the issue. Because the issue is not to get into a debate. The issue is to not take in another person's beliefs or not, but it's for them to healthily engage in their process of meaning making. Because it is about that. It's about meaning making. So the goal is not to come in and say, well, this is the way it is. None of us are in that kind of position. An equally difficult question is, well, what do you do, if the system of coping is harmful, either psychologically or physically? Now this strikes at the core of what many of us have been taught in the health professions, and that is that we are to be neutral. That we are somehow to keep our own values, our own perspective, neutral, to not impose it, which I think is true. Although I don't think it's true that we can be completely neutral. I don't think that's possible. The other thing that is aligned with that is the idea that we should not try to change a person's religious or spiritual beliefs. That's an extension of neutrality. In the psychological world, at times we can talk about that as abstinence. I abstain from acting on the patient in a way to change their thinking. Now, when I think of this as a psychologist, actually what psychologists do is help people to change their thinking. We help people to change their thinking at all times. How they think about a given event in their lives, we challenge them to think about it in multiple ways. And we do this all the time. We do what in cognitive therapy we talk about cognitive restructuring. Changing the way a person thinks about their life experiences, changing their attributions, so that we, in my way of viewing it, we actually are in the business, and all healthcare professionals are trying to evoke some kind of change. We're trying to help the individual to change along certain lines. So that being said, when someone says, well, boy, you shouldn't mess with someone's religion, you shouldn't try to affect or change their religion or the religious coping. The truth of the matter is that religion, like any other set of values that influence a person's attributions, how they see their life, we're trying to modify that at all times to help them to gain better coping. So the first point I would make is that we're actually in the business of modifying thinking. We just need to do that in a respectful way and understand certain boundaries. Now, this is the difficult one, is what if, when you're noticing the coping, it actually is harmful. Now, this is what I touched in the example I shared earlier about coping, of the young woman who unfortunately withdrew from medical care when she was diagnosed with cancer, and in fact held onto her religious coping was that she was going to beat this because of her faith in God. And then later that she was going to be cured based on notions about energy and notions about how she could channel healing power, through her body. Now, the issue here for me is not that she would have a belief that faith could cure her. That's a commonly held belief, certainly. The other belief is not so commonly held, but I would want to be respectful towards it. The issue really is, one way to view it is that it had to do more with the withdrawing of care, with the withdrawing of medical care. Now, what I would challenge with a patient like that, and if she had been a client, what I would have challenged is that those two positions, rather the position of seeking medical care, obtaining medical care, and being cured by faith, or the experience, her other beliefs, are not necessarily in opposition. So I would try to point out that there's an illogic to part of what she was believing. Also in her case, I would have focused on the fact that her belief that there would be through her faith that she would be healed was actually not a very spiritual orientation. That was an orientation that had more to do with her wanting to self-direct her care. This was actually a form of self-directed coping when you looked at it carefully as compared to deferring, because she really wasn't leaving it up to God or leaving it up to God's resources in the form of medical care, for example. It really was her intent of saying, I am going to do this. So, the first thing is I would take the stance that we in fact influence, part of our job is in fact to influence people, to embetter them, to help them to embetter themselves. I would do that respectfully, but I would also look at the nature of the beliefs and try to help the patient to see exactly what their beliefs were. The third, and I kind of go back to William James on this, who in many ways was the first psychologist of religion. And James, in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, talked about, if you think about, well, how do you judge religions? Is a religion a valid religion, or is it a healthy? He was asked about a healthy religion. And he says it's like a tree. You look at the fruit that the tree bears. And I would offer that as clinicians, one of the ways we look at this is that if in fact the religious coping that an individual is using is bearing fruit, is bearing processes of healing, is bringing about collaborative coping, which again I've discussed as being the most effective. So we want to see what is the tree bearing? What are holding certain beliefs, using certain coping styles, what is it bearing? Is it bringing them into a better quality of life? Is it leading them possibly to engage in all the resources available that will help in terms of their health? That's what I would look at. And if in fact we notice that holding a certain belief is not doing that, then that can be challenged. Not because the patient believes differently than me. It's not about personal values here in terms of the clinician. We should never impose our personal values. But it's because in my role as a psychologist, for example, using principles that we call applied behavioral analysis, that I can clearly say to someone, when you hold this belief and it increases your anxiety and depression, I'm not saying their belief is wrong. What I'm saying to them is when you hold these ideas, this is the consequence. Or as William James would say, this is the fruit that thought, that way of viewing is bearing. And so as a psychologist or as a nurse, you can say to someone, which isn't imposing your values, you can say to someone, Mrs. Jones, when you think like this, then you don't follow through with the medications. Or when you think like this, you're less motivated to get up and to exercise. We can simply point this out and to really challenge them to say, if you hold these beliefs, look what these beliefs are bringing you. They're not improving you. So that's the basic notion. One is that we're not so neutral that we don't try to change people's beliefs. I suggest, certainly in psychology, we try to change people's beliefs all the time. Secondly, nevertheless, we're trying to be respectful in that. But the one thing we can always do is certainly never impose our own values, never impose our own beliefs. But what we can do is to point out when someone holds a certain belief, practices in a certain way, what's the impact on them? We can always point that out and should point that out. The question is, I'd recommend all nursing students and medical students to watch your presentation. Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad that there's something of value for everyone, and certainly I hope there is. Well, what advice do you have for new clinicians? I think it would be this, one of the first points. We should neither exalt and put on a pedestal religion and spirituality, nor should we ignore it. So we should not so focus on it that it becomes the be and end all in terms of our interventions with patients or consideration with patients, but nor should we ignore it. We have to find that sweet spot of respect, of engagement, of openness. That's, I think, the primary thing. The other is many of you might be thinking, well, my goodness, how can I learn about every religion on earth? And again, I'd suggest that what's more important is a respectful attitude, an attitude of curiosity, an attitude of interest. None of us have to be experts in religion. Okay, that's really a key point. You don't have to be an expert in religion or the psychology of religion or the psychology of spirituality. What we have to do is to be curious and respectful. Engage in a conversation with the patient. Tell me a little bit more about this. Help me to understand. Don't ever feel like, and this is hard for medical professionals, is to take a stance of not knowing because we're trained to know, we're expected to know. Here's an area where I'd suggest you're not expected to know. The young resident isn't expected to know all there is to know about a particular religion or how it influences a person. So part of it is to take on a respectful, open inquiry with the patient about, tell me more about how you see this. Help me to understand that. Could you see it another way? Oh, you think that you have this illness because you sinned? Well, help me to understand, where did you learn that? How did you come upon these thoughts? So the first thing is to realize we don't have to be experts on every religion. Secondly, our goal is not to impose certainly our beliefs and so forth. It's to inquire, to engage in a process of inquiry. The last thing probably is to know that there are a lot of resources around you. There are chaplaincy, there are religious professionals who are available to consult, to come in. And again, don't feel like you have to do it all yourself. To bring other people into the picture to begin to help. But again, that spirit of openness is really key, and engagement. How can you best help someone who feels they have failed because their prayers haven't been answered? This is really challenging. This is a very difficult one. Part of it doesn't mean engaging if they're open to a conversation, if you have an informed consent to talk about it, if it in fact is your role to engage in these kinds of conversations, that then the issue becomes to help them to talk about on what basis do they have the belief that offering a certain prayer by definition will lead to the desired result. And this gets down to some very fundamental theological beliefs. How does God, how does the sacred operate in this world? And again, there's a whole range of perspectives between some individuals, some faith-filled individuals who believe that God absolutely directly intervenes in one person's life and perhaps not in another. Now, how do theologians answer that question? Why this person and not this person? Why does this person befall so much hardship and this person doesn't? Why is this person cured and another person isn't cured? I mean, this is really captured theologically in notions around mystery. This is a mystery that's beyond us. On the other hand, there are people that do not believe that God directly intervenes, but rather God is with us. God is that loving presence who has empathy and is with us and offers consolation. So there's going to be a whole host of different beliefs. The first thing would be, and again, none of us are religious, or I'm speaking for myself, I'm not a religious professional, But if, in fact, a patient feels that degree of trust that they want to talk about this, part of it is to help them to have some discourse about what do they believe. And you can always ask about, well, what's the authority for their beliefs? And oftentimes it's very useful to have someone come in who is a religious professional to give them assurance along these lines. But this is difficult, particularly if people believe that the prayers are not being answered because God has not yet forgiven them or is not resolved in them. That is a very difficult one. And so part of it is to intervene in a way to help them to see there might be other alternative explanations. And last, the question of have you any advice regarding the spiritual experience in residents with Alzheimer's disease? Well, this has been studied, and what we know is the chronicity of stressors really do play a significant role. And to see someone who you've loved go through these cognitive changes can be exceedingly difficult. Oftentimes there can be frustration, there can be anger, there can be upset with the medical system, that this is very painful. And so I think part of the advice I would give is that caregivers, just as patients, have to go, this is challenging their spirituality, this is challenging their religiosity. And they need to recognize that their coping resources are being strained as well. That's where support on multiple levels really is needed. That's kind of crucial. Having a place, having a space to talk about what for many can seem so cruel and so unimaginable and difficult is the other aspect, to be able to talk about it. Because this challenges, as we talked earlier, this challenges one's global life meaning. How we believe the nature of human life unfolds within transcendent realities. And so I think the advice I would give is to really provide that support, to give a place to talk about some of the challenges, sometimes to refer, again, to have clergy personnel, chaplains and others that can provide assistance to assist them. But again, I think it's the chronicity, the long-standing nature really strains on them. The other is to really have a place for them to accept that they probably had moments of intolerance. They probably had moments of saying or doing things that they don't feel good about. But to try to normalize that because of the long-standing kind of strain that puts on people. I think in closing, what I'd like to share is, these are wonderful questions. It's really been a privilege to have a chance to talk with you about some of these ideas. And I think what I'd like to share is to kind of go back to Schweitzer a little bit and to go back to the fact that all of us involved with individuals, these are moments where we can be, when we are really called to be human, to be fully human, to be able to care for others. And there are strains, there are difficulties, there are challenges, but this in fact is an area of our lives where we can gain in wisdom, we can gain in a deep compassion with others and with ourselves. So it's been a real pleasure to talk with you today. I know that the other presentations in this series are wonderful, and again, my very best.